This Shabbat, across the country and in Israel as well, it's not only Shabbat HaChodesh, but over 100 congregations are acknowledging Infertility Awareness Shabbat, a project of several organizations that seeks to increase sensitivity toward infertility within our Jewish communities. The date was selected by these organizations and shared with us because of Passover and the way that it is saturated with images of the laughter and questions of our children. Times like this can be particularly painful for those struggling to start or build their families. Yesh Tikva and other organizations have partnered to deliver resources for congregants facing infertility as a challenge and those who wish to support them. So please do reach out to me, and I will share these resources with you. The message of this initiative is simple and pure. People often face challenges alone and in silence. And those who do not face certain challenges must heighten our awareness of the way our words, our questions, our jokes, our assumptions can inadvertently cause additional pain to people who are already suffering. This Shabbat calls us to take more responsibility for our words and our actions. That is the call of this initiative. A call to acknowledge that sometimes we are not who we mean to be, and that when we become aware of the contradictions that we're exhibiting, we can take steps to change, to live more harmoniously with our own values. It is actually an empowering message, a message that contains within it the utmost hope and optimism about people's capacity to grow. At any age and at any stage of life, it is never too late to be a better version of ourselves. All it takes is recognition of our mistakes and the will to rectify them. Our Torah portion this week holds similar messages. This parashah, Vayikra, Leviticus, this passage this week articulates the ways in which the Israelites were to make expiation for their sins once they became aware of them. The parsha acknowledges that transgressions are not always intentional, but that they all necessitate, intentional or not, an offering, a sacrifice to make them right again. For the Israelites, the sacrifice was an animal, or if you couldn't afford an animal, then a bit of grain, in essence, a monetary offering that they would bring. For the Israelites, that is the way they made expiation. But because bringing that offering necessitated a visible, physical journey, it included what I'd like to call tonight a soul offering, an implicit acknowledgement to the self, to the community, to God, that a transgression had occurred. We can imagine that this soul offering was, for many individuals, even harder than paying that fine. It wasn't giving of your own goods to make expiation that maybe was so hard for people, but also just the act of admitting and coming forward and offering it with your own hands that was difficult. We can imagine that this was even harder for them because it meant courageously revealing our own limitations and flaws, even with the best of intentions in some cases. In our lives, too, the acknowledgement of a failure can be even harder to give than the reparation of that failure or charity for that failure. But that soul offering, that public acknowledgement, is absolutely indispensable as part of that process of expiation. The public acknowledgement that we have been less grateful or less aware or less sensitive or less fair than we ought to is the only way that the cycle of pain that was set in motion by that original sin, whatever it was, can ever be slowed or stopped. The only way others can be inspired to look inside themselves, too. The only way those who have been hurt by whatever it was we did, can begin to feel more secure in the presence of other people. Recent days and weeks have seen powerful examples of these kinds of soul offerings, and they have inspired me tonight. National Geographic published an article by its female Jewish editor-in-chief, Susan Goldberg, that acknowledges the racist coverage that the magazine has been putting forth in its long and, in many cases, honored past, exoticizing or diminishing Native peoples, ignoring social struggles, whitewashing complex situations. And Susan Goldberg writes, "I am the 10th editor of National Geographic since its founding in 1888. I am the first woman and the first Jewish person, a member of two groups that also once found discrimination here in these pages. It hurts to share the appalling stories from the magazine's past. But when we decided to devote our April magazine to the topic of race, we thought we should examine our own history before turning our reportorial gaze to others." This public acknowledgement of hers and of the magazine's is the kind of leadership that gives others strength and fortification in their own lives, and that helps every member of every group that has ever felt diminished by the way they've been portrayed to know that a new day is dawning. The New York Times has just begun a project called Overlooked, in which it will tell the stories of notable women and minorities whose obituaries were never printed in their newspaper, even as their white male counterparts were. Beacons like Sylvia Plath and Charlotte Bronte and Ida B. Wells, whose contributions to our national and international life and culture are undeniable, were overlooked by one of the most widely read obituary sections in our country for decades. And the current online obituary editor, Amisha Pagnani, and gender editor, Jessica Bennett, have led the Times to acknowledge this transgression and to try to rectify it. It is their hope that the women and the people of color who have shaped history will be given the spotlight they deserve, and that all young people who look for role models will have access to these powerful stories, as well as the powerful story of the newspaper that is willing to humble itself for the sake of truth. In Memphis, on April 4th, there will be many ways to honor the memory of Martin Luther King. One of them is the unveiling and dedication of a new historical marker that tells the whole truth of Nathan Bedford Forrest and his enthusiasm for the slave trade. Sponsored by Calvary Episcopal Church, Rhodes College, and the National Park Service, this marker will be within steps of the 1955 marker for Forrest's early home, built unlike that one. But unlike that one, the new one will explain that from 1854 to 1860, Nathan Bedford Forrest operated a profitable slave trading business at this site, and that Forrest uniquely engaged in the buying and selling of Africans illegally smuggled into the United States in violation of an 1808 congressional ban. We can never undo the terror and the pain that befell the human beings who lived their lives in bondage on the very streets that we tread today. And the way that pain continues to affect every descendant of that violent system, we cannot undo that. But we can, as a city, acknowledge that we have ignored that pain for long enough. And that naming it, though difficult, is literally the least we can do and the first important step toward healing the brokenness. Would that life were simpler, that every evil act was decisively punished, that every good intention yielded a positive result, that every bad intention yielded a bad one, and that no bad act or intention ever yielded a reward. But life is not simple. That is not the world that we live in. This month of Nisan, when we remember slavery in Egypt, must also remind us that life is muddier and more complicated than we would like. And that sometimes the only way to make something right is to wade into the mud and pore through the sheets of a newspaper or the pages of a magazine or the insensitive conversations at a dinner table for the dagger of words we never meant to send, and to make an offering of our souls, a promise for tomorrow that we will strive to do better. It is never too late to make these kinds of offerings. And as fearful as we may be of facing all of our missteps, as hard as it is to admit past mistakes, especially when they were made out of ignorance or out of willful blindness or even without malice, looking in the mirror will be easier, as well as we'll be looking in the eyes of our neighbors. And all of those missteps that we made, if we are able to make an offering of our souls, will shift from things we would like to cover up into guideposts for those who come after us, helping them on their walk toward their promised land. Shabbat Shalom.